Welcome to Leadership on the Front Foot, where we explore a wide range of leadership topics and we interview some of our community's best and brightest leaders. Leadership on the Front Foot is recorded with a live audience, and I'm delighted that you could join us today. Please feel free to pose a question at any time using the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen, and I'll get to as many questions as I can. The recordings of Leadership on the Front Foot are available on the Capital Partners website, on YouTube. They're also available in podcast form on your favourite platform. Just search for Capital Partners Private Wealth or Leadership on the Front Foot. And if you like what you hear, please feel free to subscribe to our YouTube channel and share the links. Now, I think it's fair to say that we've all been watching the news quite a bit lately. With the health impacts of the COVID crisis, its effects on the economy, I think we are all searching for accurate and truthful news. In a bygone era, news organisations were deeply respected in our society, and authentic journalism was valued as a pillar of an open and fair democracy. And it seems that technology has changed this landscape, and traditional news channels have really struggled to reinvent themselves. In the past 4 years, we've also seen this idea of fake news and alternative facts starting to emerge into the mainstream. And increasingly, democratic nations are concerned about foreign interference in the election process. So what is happening to the news? Particularly the news we used to love, know, and trust. And where can we find the news that we can rely on? So today I am joined by Jim Parker in what I think is going to be a cracker of an episode. Jim is a veteran financial journalist and a communications expert, and he's going to help me lift the lid on the real story behind the news. Jim's been in journalism and communications for over a quarter of a century, and he's worked in the Australian Financial Review, with CNBC, with the ABC, and with Reuters, often working on breaking news. Today, Jim works in investment communications, and he believes that the real message behind the news helps us become better investors. Understanding what's going on in the news makes us better consumers of the news. He's also the voice behind the website The Failed Estate, which studies the role of media in a liberal democratic society, and he observes the pressure on the craft of journalism from the breakdown of traditional media models. Jim, thanks for joining me and welcome to Leadership on the Front Foot.
It's a pleasure to be here, David.
Fantastic. Now, Jim, we always love to start by asking our guests to introduce themselves and give it a little bit of backstory on how you've got to where you are today.
Well, it's a fairly long story given how old I am, but I started... Well, I spent a few years after school not really knowing what I wanted to do. I always wanted to be a writer, and then I found out about journalism. I got into the journalism school in Auckland. This is way back in the late 70s, and it was quite competitive to get in there. Got into journalism, worked in radio for a few years, ended up in Perth actually, and worked in Perth for the ABC, moved to London, worked around Asia, and finally landed back in Sydney working in financial journalism, and I've been here ever since.
Yeah, fantastic. Now, I know you're passionate about journalism and the news, and you spend all your time helping investors decipher the news. But what I'd like you to do to kick off is just walk us through some of the big trends and changes. It feels to me as though the early part of your career were almost the golden years of journalism. You had the early stages of technology, which appeared to be incredibly beneficial, but we seem to have got ourselves into a different place today. I wonder if you could walk us through your perspective on all of that.
Okay, well, I think the first thing that people need to appreciate is the difference between journalism and the media. So the media really provides the platform for journalism to exist, and media exists as a business because of advertising mainly. What happened in the last, well, before you said, as you mentioned, the golden years, was that media had a monopoly on getting publishing out there. And, you know, if you wanted to get something published, you had to go through the media. An ad, for example, if you wanted to sell your house or a car or you advertised a job, that was usually through the classifieds. And I do remember the Sunday Times in Perth had more classifieds than just about any paper I've ever seen.
Yeah.
But of course, that's gone now. The internet has taken that all over, and that destroyed the business model of traditional media. And as a result, you've seen much less investment in journalism, and that's had an impact on quality.
So just walk us through the emergence of the new technologies then. Why has that been such a big impact?
Well, I remember this going back. So when I first started in journalism, we had to use carbon paper. So we typed our story on a typewriter, and we gave a carbon copy to the sub-editor who uses red pen and said, no, you can't say that. And it was really old school. Then they brought in electric typewriters, and that was a big thing. And then computers. And I remember in 1992, 93, I was working for a US company, and they said, we want you to put your email address or the company's email address at the bottom of the story. And I thought, what on earth is this? This is crazy stuff. And they said, no, this is going to change everything. And I watched it over a period of about 10 years, completely rip the media apart, because suddenly anybody could be a publisher. Anybody could put their thoughts out there once the internet came along. And the media lost its monopoly for advertising, lost its monopoly for publishing. And so that had an effect on the media generally. So from about 1998, 2000, really when Google came along was when it really started to change. I was working at Fairfax back then, and you remember Seek.com came along, and this is where they advertised jobs. I was working for Fairfax, and Fairfax had the opportunity to buy Seek at that time because Seek was a little startup. Well, within a few years, Seek's market capitalization dwarfed that of Fairfax. And that was one of the biggest mistakes that Fairfax ever made. But it was always going to happen. The rivers of gold, as they call them, the classified ads that supported journalism suddenly dried up because all that advertising went online. And you're living with the consequences now. So we've had News Corporation, the biggest publisher in Australia, has been laying off hundreds of jobs. Lots of jobs have gone in the last 5 years. Fairfax is a shadow of the company it used to be when I was there. Even the ABC has been laying off journalists. So a much smaller media and much harder for them to cover the news properly. And that has consequences, as you mentioned at the start, to democracy generally.
Yeah, okay. So I want to come back to that because I think that's a very, very important point. We should dig into that. But I'd also I get a sense that it's not just technology companies. Every time, particularly when you're in the United States, I've noticed this in the United States, there is just news, financial news as well, everywhere. How much of an impact has the 24-hour news cycle been?
Well, that's, again, a consequence of the technology. So because everyone, not just Google, but the media itself can publish every second of every day, there's no restraint on when you can publish and how much. So the pressure then is on journalists to pump stuff out. Now, at the same time as they're being required to pump stuff out 24/7, their ability to do so has fallen significantly because there's far fewer of them. So they've been asked to produce more and more with less and less. And you can guess what that actually means for quality for the public. So that's why you're seeing more and more pressure to pump stuff out and less ability to do so.
I remember as a kid, we'd sit down for dinner and Dad would have come home from work and we'd be finishing dinner and clearing the plates and we'd all be trying to have a chat over the washing up. Of course, this is before dishwashers became a thing. And the news, that very distinctive lead music for the ABC News would come on, and Dad would be there, shh, 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 because that was the big fix of news that you'd get each evening, the 7 p.m. news bulletin. Now, that's a thing of the past, where you had a news source that people really, really relied on. And I suspect a very large proportion of the community, society, would have tuned into that news.
It's true. In the old days, you're quite right. Everyone used to watch the same news every night. So we had an agreement on the basic facts. But the problem now is you can really choose the outlet that suits your own prejudices. So, the right wing in the US all watches Fox and People on the left of the spectrum might watch CNN or the center. So there's a news network for whatever you want, and you can choose the facts to suit. And this, again, is a consequence of the pressure on the media, because they don't supply a mass market anymore. There isn't a mass market. There are individual markets, and the media has to address those individual markets. The consequence of that, though, is there's no agreed truth anymore. And as we've seen, the consequences of that are quite serious.
So I genuinely don't want to turn this into a political conversation, but I find it fascinating to watch the events unfold in the United States, because they're clearly a very deeply divided society. And it exercises my mind around what is the cause and what is the effect. Is it the politicians, some of the outrageous things that are happening in United States policy that are driving the wedge, or is it the news outlets that are driving this, and we've just got some players who are playing to that infrastructure, if you will?
Yeah. So I think we're seeing a failure of institutions, but in terms of the media itself, and the media is one of those institutions, traditionally called the fourth estate because it keeps the government honest, it's less able to do its job. So what tends to happen now, and I'll give you an example, a politician or someone will say something, not just a politician, it could be a fund manager, says, we think the market return for the next year is going to be X. And then they'll just report that. Now, journalists should really come back 6 months later and say, well, that didn't really happen, so account for what you said. Or if a politician says an outright lie, you should be able to say, yes, but these are the facts. And that's getting harder and harder because they don't have the resource. When I was a journalist, you tended to have specialists. You had financial news specialists, you had economic specialists, you had police roundsmen, you had people who covered the courts, and they became quite expert in the fields they covered. Now that expertise doesn't exist anymore because they have so few journalists. You don't know what you're going to be doing from one day to the next. So you'll go straight from reporting a police crime to covering the courts, to covering the share market, to covering politics. No one's got any expertise and no one's got any institutional memory. And the result of that is we don't know what they said yesterday because someone else was covering the story yesterday. You see how this works? So it has an effect on quality, and people, I think, can sense that.
So my next question was going to be about fake news, but from what you've just said, people can say what they like because there's really no one holding them account. There is no checks and balances in the news. It is just a reporting service rather than a journalism service that requires intelligent effort and analysis and thought.
Yes, that's true. To me, this is an economic issue for the media. The media's business model has been destroyed by the internet. That's essentially what's happened. That means they don't know how to subsidize good quality journalism. And we need good quality journalism. I think we need it like running water, fresh food, housing, shelter, a media that keeps politicians to account and increases transparency and gives people facts that are accurate, that are fair, that are balanced, is what we need. That's one of the essential elements of a democracy. As for fake news, that's got a distinct meaning. I mean, Trump used the term fake news to mean something else, to basically have a go at traditional media, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, Reuters, and called them fake news. But fake news actually was material that was created for Facebook, usually by people in Eastern Europe, Macedonia, for instance, to drive clicks and as a business model. Now, they would just make stuff up. They would Photoshop stuff. Now, I'll give you an example. Last year, there was a story going around on Facebook, and it had Gordon Ramsay, the chef, and Hugh Jackman, our own Hugh Jackman, recommending this high return, low risk investment scheme for people. And this was Hugh Jackman was right behind it. And all you had to do was give them your bank account details and they could guarantee you a high return with low risk. Now, everyone was sharing this on Facebook. $100 million people lost through this. It was fake. Now, that is fake news. And it was unreliable information. These people in Eastern Europe were using celebrities' names. This is in the Ukraine. It was a deliberate sting. ASIC got onto it eventually, but it wasn't just Australia, it was all over the world. That's the sort of material that has a real effect on people's lives because it's bad information. Now, that is fake news.
It's interesting, isn't it? That I'm aware of this, but when you're shopping for a new barbecue, say, it could be anything. There's news feeds all over these websites, and some of the claims are absolutely outrageous. So we how do we deal with that? How do people listening to this podcast actually deal with that?
So the way I talk about it, we've had the coronavirus, and the health authorities have said there are essential things you do for your hygiene. You have to maintain social distancing, wash your hands regularly, don't put your hands on your face. I talk about information hygiene. We need information hygiene as well. And what I mean by that is that, number one, do not get your news off social media. Social media does not employ journalists or editors. They are just reproducing other people's content. They have no editorial standards. And worst of all, what Facebook and Google are doing is they're cannibalizing traditional media. So 80% of the advertising revenues that used to go to established media companies that actually employ newsrooms and journalists are now all going to Facebook and Google. They've got no commitment to truth or editorial responsibility. So the first thing I say to people is don't trust news you see on Facebook. Because a lot of the time it's made up or you're being manipulated by some very dark forces. Number two, always never depend on one source. If you see someone making some claim, have a look at somewhere else, Google it and see if anyone else is reporting that. So the high yield, low risk, high return investment, I would have checked that out more widely than just Facebook. So use multiple sources. And the other thing I say to people is go straight to the source. And one of the great things about the internet, if you see someone reporting that the IMF says there's going to be a world depression, well, what did the IMF say? Go to the IMF's website and have a look at it directly. You can do that. That's one of the things the media in some sense has been disintermediated. They've been taken out of the middle. So you've got the ability now as a news consumer to be much more discerning, but you're going to have to be more active and you're going to have to be very careful about never relying on one source. Use multiple sources.
Now, this is really important because we were chatting earlier about the relative size of some of these organisations. And in fact, I might get you to repeat some of those stats because they're just mind-boggling. In that, the Googles and the Facebooks are so powerful. What you've just said, and I'm going to loop back to it, what you've just said is incredibly important information for listeners.
So this goes wider than journalism. You think at the moment, what are the biggest, most powerful companies in the world today in what they were, say, 20 years ago? So 20 years ago, and this is not long ago, we're talking the late 90s, 2000, ExxonMobil, General Electric, those big companies, IBM. The biggest companies in the world today by far in terms of market capitalization are Apple, Google, Facebook, Netflix, Amazon. These are all companies in the information industry. They are huge. The information economy is like oil was 20 years ago. It's big, big business. And the reason it's big business is people's attention is worth money. So I say to people, the shortage in the world today is not information. We're deluged with information. We've got too much information. The shortage is your attention. And your attention as news consumers is incredibly valuable. The most valuable thing is your eyeballs. And that's why you're seeing newspapers now really behaving more like Facebook or Google. So you showed me earlier on before the podcast today, the front page of the West Australian has a cartoon of Clive Palmer on it. So newspapers are increasingly using Photoshop and other things like that to turn the front pages of their newspapers into virtual cartoons. And they're doing that because they're having to behave like social media because that's where the money is. The drive for attention is so competitive, they're having to go down market and further down market all the time.
And yet, for the people who will be driving the next generation of leadership and will be, you know, driving the next generation and the next wave of social reform. Facts matter. Facts matter. And there are some TV shows and some TV channels that even have news in their name. And yet so much of what one sees, if they spend any time watching those channels, is actually not news, it's opinion.
Yeah. Yeah. So the thing about opinion, people say to me, why is there so much opinion in the media these days? You know, and I say, well, look, it's economics. It's a lot cheaper to put an opinion on the front page than it is to put a piece of careful, considered, well-researched analysis and investigative journalism. That takes a lot of time and a lot of money, but it's much easier to have someone on the front page of the newspaper telling you what to think about something. And they don't really care whether half the population hates that person, half the population loves that person. They just want a reaction. That's what it's about.
In fact, in many respects, you know, the more divisive, the better, based on what you've said earlier.
Yeah, you know, this explains that, you know, in New South Wales, we had, you know, Alan Jones. You know, Alan Jones, he says the most outrageous things, you know, and he's got a core audience of people who like him, but he wasn't paid to be balanced and sensible and measured and rational. He was paid to say things that people would share on social media and say, you won't believe what Alan Jones just said now. And here's a link to his webcast. Well, exactly. You're doing his job for him.
So that was entertainment then. So
entertainment.
There's no pretense about that being news. That's entertainment and opinion, right?
It is, but he's often presenting himself as news. So he'll use facts, but are not facts at all. And he'll get his research all wrong. So I've got no problem with people having an opinion, but it's got to be based on fact. When they're starting making up facts to base an opinion upon, that's where I have a problem. And that's where journalists have to step in and say, no, that's not right. These are the numbers, and this is what we've got to base it on. Otherwise, people are basing their opinions on fallacies. I think that's where the issue is.
And look, everyone has an opinion on the ABC, and again, I certainly don't want to make this political, but it certainly seems that the ABC plays a very important part in Australian society. When indeed we're probably lucky to have it.
I agree. I mean, I think you need public broadcasting. Some of the best journalism that's been done around the world, the BBC has done some fantastic journalism, you know, covering the wars in the Middle East and in Africa. They wouldn't be done with commercial media. And the way I say to people, because I was brought up in public broadcasting, that was my first job. I say the reason for public broadcasting is to do things that the market won't deliver, because the market is always going to go where they can get the most eyeballs. But, you know, a lot of people might want to watch it, but there needs to be people covering things that maybe, you know, a lot of people aren't interested, but we need to know what's going on in the Pacific at the moment, you know, with China's influence, what's going on, you know, in other parts of the world. And that Channel 9 isn't going to be interested in that because it doesn't involve a celebrity. So, you know, serious news, we need public broadcasting to do it. And there has to be a public subsidy for that. If it was me, you know, I understand the pressures that the ABC is under commercially or in terms of funding. I would actually just focus on news. Get rid of all the opinion shows, get rid of the Q&A, get rid of that. There's too much opinion. We don't need more opinion. We just need news, straight news. And I'd spend my money on that, but I'm not the CEO of the ABC. So there we go.
Well, maybe you could apply for Ida's job. You're well qualified.
No, thanks.
So I do want to come back to this idea that people can control, to some degree at least, what they consume. And I'd like to recap that, because I think that was we glossed over it, and that was such an important piece of your wisdom. How do we get news that we can really rely upon?
So my instinct on this one is to find sources that you can trust and never just use one source. So my go-to source is Reuters and Bloomberg. I've worked for Reuters. I think they're the best news organization in the world. They're not as probably as good as they used to be because they've lost money as well, but they're a straight news organization, and their news and information is available for free on the web. There's a trust structure for Reuters, which prevents their news division being commercialized and taken over. So what you see with Reuters is pretty straight, and they have very, very strong rules around sourcing and balance. They've got very good quality journalists working for them. So I tend to be, Reuters is my go-to. If I've heard something that's happened in the world, I go to them first. The other one is Bloomberg. Bloomberg is pretty good. This isn't financial news, but general news as well. Both very good sources. And then, I have my other sources that I use in finance. It'll be the FT, the Financial Times, the Economist, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and the BBC, and the Guardian. Those are my go-to sources. So I tend to go to them first. I definitely won't go to Facebook. I definitely won't go to Channel 9, and I won't. Most of the Australian media is not great, and that's a problem. But this is the consequences of having one company being too dominant for too long, I think.
It's also quite a challenge for thinking people too, because the power of the big communications, information technology companies, there is so much power there that it is hard to imagine how the traditional news media can even ever compete with that. So do we just accept that the only sources of real news and real genuine analysis will be from those organisations like Reuters that are dedicated news organisations, and they survive as such?
Yes, I think so. I think we have to find some public subsidy, because I know from my friends there that they're suffering from cutbacks as well. To me, just to be slightly controversial here, I think there's a case for breaking up the big tech giants, and I'm not the only person saying this. There was an analogy to the early 20th century, late 19th century, when President Teddy Roosevelt, who was a Republican, by the way, broke up US Steel and the big monopolies in the US because it wasn't good for capitalism. We need competition. And I think that's getting to the point with the big tech giants like Google and Facebook and Amazon in particular. They're just too powerful. And that's resulting in a loss of competition. They're virtual monopolies. I would break them up. And I actually quite like the way the Australian government at the moment is actually having a go at getting Google and Facebook to pay the news media directly for the use of their content. I think that's actually a good idea, but I'm not sure they're going to have much success in it.
I was going to say, Jim, what's your prediction on the outcome of that?
I think they've got Buckleys. I think Google and Facebook, the problem is the media companies, and Alan Kohler made this point, the media companies need Google and Facebook because they're not getting any print revenue anymore. Their print revenues are declining because people aren't buying newspapers. Anybody under 40 doesn't buy. I don't buy newspapers, and I'm well over 40. So they're having to rely on digital advertising, and digital advertising is a race to the bottom. And most of the digital advertising revenue, as I mentioned, is going to Google and Facebook. So the newspapers need Google and Facebook to link to their news pages, and that's just not going to happen if they get them offside. So this is what I'm talking about. This monopoly situation is quite unhealthy. I don't think the government's going to win that one, although everyone around the world is looking at that with great interest.
I'm going to shift the conversation to an area that I am passionate about, and I know that you share this. When we look at a news report and we're fearful because of it, it might be a coronavirus or anything like that. Generally, we don't have to act upon it. We feel bad about it. But when our money's involved, the news plays a very, very significant role in the news feed, plays a very significant role in the emotions of investors. And never has it been more so the case than now with coronavirus and all the economic events. Help us understand some of your research and understanding of the role that the news plays in how we behave as investors.
So when I first started as a journalist, and this is going back a long way, the business pages of the newspaper, no one ever read. The worst role that you would have in a news organization was to be consigned to the business report because no one ever read it. And then something changed from the late 80s, from the 80s into the 90s. They started to demutualize everything. They started to privatize things. People who used to own their NRMA shares or whatever, or the AMP, they had shares in these organizations. Then we had the growth of compulsory superannuation. So suddenly everybody was responsible for funding their own retirement. That meant that they needed good information. And suddenly business and economic news moved from the back of the paper to the front of the paper. And this was under Paul Keating, because Paul Keating was opening up the economy and journalists were getting excited about economic reform, and it became front page news. Now, from that point on, finance became sexy. Then we saw all the takeovers with Christopher Skase, and I was in Perth at the time, Alan Bond. He was on the front page of the newspaper every day. Robert Holmes at court. Finance became sexy. But with that becoming really sexy and exciting, it became much more like other types of news. It became much more about color and movement and what's breaking now and what's the latest with so-and-so. It became about personalities. And people started to believe that you could get a high return with little risk because we heard about these swashbucklers like Skase, and everyone wanted to be like Skase. The problem is, we know, you and I know, that it doesn't work like that. That return is not very sexy. It's about diversification, controlling what you can, making sure you don't pay too much, and staying disciplined. That's pretty boring. And that won't make the front page of the newspaper. So you've got to make it exciting. And that's where it went wrong.
Yeah, you once said to me, I hope I get this right. You once gave me the analogy of the magazines, the health magazines, where they say, amazing new diet. Eat one jelly bean and 6 celery sticks, eat at each meal and you'll lose 20 kilos or whatever it was. And then the following week it was the soup diet. And the week after that, it was the Kim Kardashian diet.
It's the same with finance. So, you heard they'll sell you whatever's new. So before the GFC, we heard all about these mortgage-backed securities that were fantastic. You parcel all these mortgages up together and you get an additional return over cash with no extra risk. Well, we know what happened then. Then when the financial crisis happened, it all became capital guaranteed products, a product that you couldn't lose. So they're always trying to sell you. It's like fashion. They're trying to sell you whatever is new at the time because they get paid and the end client, the investor, doesn't get paid. Now, this isn't just journalists. This is advertisers, because journalists, at the same time that all this demutualization and privatization has happened, the media has caved in, as I said at the very beginning, and that's made them much more dependent on advertising. So, for instance, I used to work for the AFR, for Smart Investor magazine, and we had to write stories all the time about these things called contracts for difference, which are very high risk derivatives where you're betting on the difference in prices and securities at different times. It's really, really high risk, and you can end up losing a lot of money. But we had to write stories about this because the advertisers were CFD providers. And that's what's happened in financial media, is the Chinese walls that used to exist between the editorial side and the advertising side have broken down. So a lot of time what you're reading, you think you're reading news, you're actually reading an ad.
And that's interesting, because coming back to the diet analogy, every week there's a different diet. The news probably should say, look, sleep well, eat in moderation, drink in moderation, exercise regularly, have plenty of water, but then they don't get another edition.
Because they're trying to sell you something, and because they need to sell you something, they need to repackage pretty prosaic information, which is what a financial advisor would tell them. And they have to make it seem sexy, because people don't want to buy something that seems pretty ordinary. And it is ordinary, but it's the truth. And unfortunately, that's the truth. So that's what I've been doing. And as you know, for the last 15 years nearly, I've been working in investment communications and trying to tell the right story for people, because where I think this is really unfair, and this is where the social justice element comes out, if people are going to have to save for their own retirement and take that risk on their shoulders, then there's a real responsibility for the financial media to give them solid information, and don't sell them something that is really high risk is something that's low risk. That's just not right. So, I get a bit on my high horse about this because I think it's not fair on people.
I saw a report recently that was bringing out the information as the news got worse and worse and worse in the global financial crisis. They had statistics of the number of members in one of the major industry funds switching out of their equities portfolio and into cash, and it actually was spookily that the peak of people switching was spookily congruent with the top of the market. You know, where things were just, you know, things just was as scary as they possibly be, and people were piling out, and immediately things thereafter recovered. And there was a similar news report recently of people doing exactly the same thing in March this year.
Yeah.
And I think I'd like to unpack this a little bit more in terms of your expertise around investor behavior and some of the challenges that we're actually up against.
So to make a really meta point here, what's going on is that the internet is changing everything, and the ability to publish and have real-time information constantly. We're all walking around with these devices in our pockets that are more powerful than the computer that sent man to the moon in 1969. So we've got this enormously powerful information source. And what that's doing is compressing people's attention span. So they hear that something's happening, they have to do something about it. And we're being trained to do that by our phones. Forward this, click on this. You always feel that you have to do something when something happens. And it's that desire to do something about it that's pushing people into making radical and foolish decisions with their money. Unfortunately, I ended up working for, you know, a company a few years ago that actually has got a really good investment philosophy, and I feel quite comfortable with that. But it really, I find it appalling that people are being pushed into making impulsive decisions, and I think that's as a result of the internet and what it's done to our attention spans.
Quite extraordinary, isn't it? Yeah. Okay. So we're getting to the point where we'll start our wrap up, and I just want to really leverage off your wisdom, and also ask you to give us a little bit of a sense of context around what the future might look like for us in terms of the news media and the technology giants. And in your opinion, how do we, as responsible consumers, navigate our way through this?
Well, I don't really want to go into the bad scenario because that will really depress people. The good scenario is that people are becoming much more aware of how information is made. And we're seeing this example in Victoria at the moment with the COVID thing. And we're seeing press conferences with journalists screaming at politicians. And, you know, it's just not very edifying. And people are seeing how the sausages are made, and it's not very attractive. So I think the good thing that's happening is people are becoming much more media savvy and much more selective. That's a good thing. The next thing that has to happen is people have to start insisting on better quality of journalism. And that involves being much more active as consumers. Now, I've suggested to people, if you really don't like the way that newspaper or your television station treated that story, don't contact the editor because they're not going to do anything about it. Contact the advertisers. Be much more proactive and say, you need to do something. How do you feel about your brand being associated with that rubbish? Is one thing that you can do. And insist on good quality. And the other thing you can do is dig into your pocket. Now, there's a few publications that I really like, and I'm actually prepared to pay subscriptions to those products because that's the only way they can survive. And if they've got more subscriptions, they're less reliant on advertising revenue, which means they're less reliant on the pressures from advertisers wanting them to do the wrong thing. So I think it has to be an element of trust between you and make the relationship between the journalist and the reader, not between the journalist and the advertiser and the reader. Take the advertiser out of the middle is my point.
Isn't that interesting? Because there's an analogy to your point you've just made, and that's it's back in the area of investing, and it's around responsible investing, social and responsible investing, where people and I see there's someone on the in our audience today who feels passionately about this and has held us to account and said, I do not want to be investing in these sorts of investments. I do not want to be investing in fossil fuels, and I do not want to be investing in this, that, and the other thing. And we've had some wonderful conversations around how we're going to achieve that. Now, that's an individual investor saying, my values don't line up with mainstream investment. I want something different. And it sounds to me as though the same thing is true of the news. My values don't line up with what I'm hearing, seeing, and consuming, and I need to vote with my feet on that.
Yes, I agree entirely. It's a very good analogy. It means that people actually have got a lot of power. We do have a lot of power collectively and individually, but collectively a lot more. And just as you mentioned with responsible investment, which I'm a big subscriber to myself, if we have to do this ourselves, if we have to wear these risks, then let's insist on better governance. Let's insist on better institutions. Let's insist on a more responsible media that takes its responsibilities seriously, giving people good information, balanced and accurate. And think about the responsibilities they have to their own readers, not to their advertisers. We need that. If we don't have that, then we won't have a functioning democracy. So I'm passionate about it as well.
Yeah, fantastic. I am going to just refer our readers to a book that was written by a fellow I've come to know, a fellow by the name of Jamie Susskind. He's a very clever barrister from the United Kingdom. And he wrote a book called Future Politics. So anyone who is interested in this topic in terms of the impact that technology and news organisations potentially can have on our future, that Future Politics is a book well worth reading. Jim, it's been wonderful having you on Leadership on the Front Foot, and thank you for sharing your insight. Thank you also to our audience joining me on this 8-episode series of Leadership on the Front Foot. This is our final episode, so I'm just going to encourage you to keep an eye out for our next podcast series called A Good Life, Redefining Retirement, hosted by our very own Damon Sugden. Feel free to catch up on Leadership on the Front Foot via your favourite podcast channel or on YouTube. Thanks for joining me today.